I have a very interesting story of Michael Jackson and the day he died. I was at the hospital where he died at and when he died at. So let me go ahead and tell you what happened. So I was actually driving on the day he died. I was on the west side of LA. I lived at that time in Westwood, which is basically, I lived in an area a block from the hospital where he was pronounced dead. But anyways, I was driving. It was these two girls in a Benz SUV, right? It was kind of crazy. So as I was at the stop sign, they pulled up next to me and said, "Hey, what's up?" I'm like, "What's up? What's going on?" And they just asked me out the blue. Again, it was so random. They asked me, "Have you heard about what happened to Michael Jackson?" I said, "No, he's in the hospital right now." I'm like, "What?" And it was like, and they just drove off, and I decided to go back home because I was actually going to a restaurant in the area. So as I was driving back home, because remember, I live a block from the hospital where he was pronounced dead. So I had no idea at the time he was dead, and nobody did. Okay. So as I was driving back, I saw in the sky around my house, miles away, a bunch of helicopters, right? You know, of course, it was going to be news helicopters up there. So as I was driving, I'm like, oh my God. And I lived, like I said, in an apartment complex right by the hospital, so I had to park my car, and it was nothing but fans and people all over the place. It was chaos, and you would hear journalists from every country. You hear all different languages from every country in Europe and in the Middle East and in Asia and South and Central America. Everywhere, everybody was there. You had fans, singing and dancing and just hoping that he is able to make it, because we were basically shocked. He's in the hospital. What happened? Right? And we were just having a good time. We were sad at the same time. It was interesting. And we were waited and waited and waited and waited, and then I went back home because at the time he was still not pronounced dead yet, at least in the public, right? But I do remember one interesting thing. There was a LA County Sheriff's helicopter that landed on the roof of the hospital and then later took off. We had no idea that they were carrying Michael Jackson's body. We had no idea until afterwards, until we saw the news and said this is the helicopter that took his body, and we were like, oh my God, I saw the helicopter land on top of the hospital, and then later take off. And that was again, this was before like Instagram and all the major social media platform where people would constantly stream. I was on an app, I forgot the name of the app, where I was streaming. It was real grainy because at that time it was, I didn't have, there was no 5G, or whatever at the time. It was basically 3G or maybe 4G, right? And it was just crazy, and I never forget that moment. I mean, I was there when history was made, to see all the people there gathered where I live at, basically, a block away, and knowing that the greatest artist of all time died. And, again, life, tomorrow's never promised. God knows when you would pass away. And, this was an interesting moment in my life. Again, I lived in Westwood at that time. I saw history in the making, and unfortunately, the greatest artist that ever lived in terms of music and entertainment in general died. That's my story. Peace out.